Hey guys, tonight we gather by the glow of a fire that smells faintly of oak smoke and old polish. The wallpaper behind you blooms in deep burgundy, and the faint tick of a mantel clock competes with the steady hiss of the flames. Outside, London's fog drapes itself across the window panes, but in here, inside this Edwardian parlor, the night feels like an island of warmth adrift in history. You can almost hear the ghosts of medieval storytellers pressing close, eager to reclaim their stage. You're about to hear what they whispered centuries ago, except retold by people who thought they'd outgrown superstition. Spoiler, they hadn't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it there right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Edwardians loved a good contradiction. They saw themselves as thoroughly modern, electric lights, telephones, suffragettes, and spiritualism all tangled in the same polite century. Yet when twilight came, they found their comfort in old tales. There was something deeply satisfying about gathering around a hearth and pretending, just for an evening, that the world was still young and enchanted. You sit among them, teacup warming your hands as the first storyteller clears his throat. He's a man with side whiskers and a mischievous glint in his eye, and he begins, "In the old days, before our fathers' were born." You recognize the pattern immediately. The rhythm of fireside storytelling that has soothed and terrified for 1,000 years. The Edwardians borrowed it shamelessly, polishing old legends the way they polished their brass candlesticks, to a gleaming, self-aware nostalgia. Some historians still argue whether this fascination was escapism or a kind of national therapy after the trauma of the industrial age. The parlor is lined with books, some bound in leather, others new with sharp ink. The wallpaper's floral motif curls around a framed illustration of St. George. "Ah yes," says a woman in mauve, "that one again, slaying dragons in daylight, very British." Her laugh ripples through the room, brittle and clever, but when the fire pops suddenly, she jumps just a little. You smile. Skepticism and superstition always dance closest at the edges of light. Tonight's gathering is hosted by Lady Pennington, a widow of unimpeachable taste and a habit of collecting curious people. Her drawing room has become something of a haven for storytellers, professors, and mild eccentrics who fancy themselves both rational and romantic. On the sideboard, the tea tray glints beside a small brass figure of a knight, his sword half drawn. Purely decorative, Lady Pennington insists, though one suspects she likes the symbolism. You lean back and listen as someone mentions how even King Edward himself fancied the Arthurian ideals, chivalry reinvented as moral elegance. The conversation drifts toward medievalism, that odd Edwardian obsession with reviving the Middle Ages in stained glass and stage plays. There's talk of William Morris, Gothic revival furniture, and a new fashion for illuminated manuscripts being reproduced for the wealthy. One man, an Oxford scholar with spectacles shaped like keyholes, argues that the appeal lies in contrast. The industrial world felt too sharp, too fast, so people sought comfort in the imagined softness of the past. Still, nostalgia wasn't the only motive. Beneath the lace and tea, there's a flicker of unease. The turn of the century had made ghosts fashionable again. Seances were dinner entertainment, and parlor games often involved automatic writing. The medieval world, with its saints and sorcery, suddenly didn't feel so distant. "You see," says the scholar, "it's the same impulse, faith disguised as folklore." A young artist, perhaps too bold for the company, interrupts. "Faith," he says, "or fear," he gestures toward the fire. "Every tale begins and ends here, doesn't it? Heat and shadow. Maybe they just missed feeling small before something bigger than themselves." The group murmurs. Someone refills your teacup. Someone else turns the page of an old book whose spine crackles. The story shifts. Someone recalls a medieval ballad, the Trois Corbees, where two ravens discuss a fallen knight. The melody hums low in the back of your throat as if the words remember themselves. The Edwardians adore the gloom, They sip melancholy like port wine. A lady recites a verse and forgets the ending, and another fills in, wrong but confident. It doesn't matter. The act of remembering together is what binds the room. Then comes the first tale proper, almost an invocation. The ghost of a minstrel wandering the streets of York, singing songs no one has written yet. His shadow falls across both centuries at once, the medieval and the Edwardian, bridging them like an echo carried through time. You can feel the audience leaning forward. For all their electric lamps and motor cars, they still crave the music of candlelight and legend. A draft sighs under the door and Lady Pennington rises to close it. "You'll catch a chill," she warns, smiling. "But you know better, the air's not cold from weather. It's the past breathing in." This is the magic of these Edwardian parlors. They are museums of memory where myth puts on a monocle and sips Darjeeling. Yet, if you listen closely, beneath the politeness, you can still hear the rough laughter of medieval peasants, the chants of monks, the whispers of nuns who saw visions and weren't believed. You glance at the window again at your own faint reflection. The gaslight flickers, distorting your face. For just a moment you see someone else's, someone wearing a coif or a crown or perhaps a minstrel's smile. The centuries overlap, shimmering like heat above a candle. The storyteller clears his throat again, the chatter quiets, and you realize that what's about to begin isn't just history, it's inheritance. You draw your chair closer to the fire. The story is waiting. The man with the mischievous glint, the one who began his tale with "in the old days," leans forward now, elbows on knees. His voice softens as though he's about to confess something half-believed, half-dreamed. "There was once," he begins, "a minstrel of York. You've likely heard of him in some form, perhaps as a whisper of a song that no one admits to knowing. They say he played for kings and thieves alike, and that even death leaned close when he sang." A ripple of amusement stirs through the parlor. The Edwardians adore a good ghost story, especially when it wears the trappings of scholarship. A professor in a velvet smoking jacket chuckles. Ah yes, the spectral performer, likely a moral invention of the 15th century to warn against vanity. Or, says Lady Pennington, perhaps vanity's reward. You sip your tea, sweet and faintly metallic, as the tale unfurls like music remembered from another life. The minstrel, the man explains, was named Thomas of York, though in some versions he's simply the player. He was said to have charmed every heart in the city with his voice, yet one night, during a royal visit, he mocked his lord with a song too clever by half. Offended, the king ordered him banished. Thomas disappeared into the north winds, his lute left hanging on the tavern wall. Weeks later, the same tavern swore they heard him playing again, unseen but unmistakable. The tune was one no one could quite remember afterward. Now, centuries later, Edwardian tourists in York still report hearing faint notes along the minster walls when the streets fall empty. A cobbler's apprentice once claimed he followed the sound and saw a pale man in tattered velvet strumming beneath a lantern that wasn't lit. "A trick of acoustics," the professor says dismissively. "The city's old stones hold sound strangely." "Or maybe the song held him," Lady Pennington murmurs, her gaze lingering on the fire. You can almost hear it, the thin wisp of melody winding through time. The Edwardians, for all their rational airs, live in a world where science and science hold hands beneath the table. Gramophones and ghost stories coexist comfortably. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was hypocrisy or hope, a refusal to let mystery die beneath electric light. The storyteller continues, lowering his voice. "They say the minstrel still performs for those who have lost something, a tune for the bereaved, a verse for the guilty. And if you follow the sound long enough, you'll end up standing at your own grave, humming the refrain." A nervous laugh escapes someone in the back. "Delightful nonsense," he says, but his eyes don't meet anyone else. One woman, a journalist visiting from the London Chronicle, pulls a notebook from her bag. "I've heard of that legend," she says. "Some years ago, a photographer tried to capture the ghost during a midnight exposure by the Minster gates. His camera plate came out perfectly clear, except for a faint streak of silver light shaped like a man bowing. She closes the notebook. The exposure was 30 seconds. Maybe that's all it takes to make eternity blink. You shiver, not from cold, but from recognition. The Edwardians are playing the same game their ancestors did, pretending they don't believe while secretly wanting to. The storyteller smiles, clearly pleased by the tension. There's a little-known verse, he says, found scribbled inside a church hymn book, likely 17th century, he recites. He sang before the dawn could break. His breath the frost upon the lake. He played where none but shadows trod, and left his song in hands of God. A hush settles. The fire crackles, throwing sparks like tiny souls fleeing upward. Someone sighs, perhaps relieved the verse didn't end in damnation. Then Lady Pennington, ever the ringmaster, leans in. "Tell me," she says, "do you think he knows we're still listening?" The question lingers. The Edwardians adore their rhetorical hauntings. The professor clears his throat and delivers a safe historical fact. The medieval guilds of York did employ licensed minstrels, roughly 30 recorded between 1450 and 1500. Most were itinerant, traveling from feast to feast. Yet none vanished into thin air, says the journalist. Plenty did, the professor counters, just not romantically. You grin. The fire reflects in every teacup like a constellation, small suns flickering in porcelain galaxies. The conversation spirals from history to heresy. Someone insists that music has its own ghosts, vibrations lingering in matter long after the notes stop. The young artist from earlier nods, claiming that memory itself is a form of haunting. Every time we remember a melody, we resurrect someone, he says. Outside, a carriage clops past, its sound momentarily blending with the storyteller's voice. For an instant, it feels like rhythm, hoofbeats and heartbeats aligned. Then the silence returns, thick and alive. A gentle laugh from Lady Pennington restores the parlor's composure. "Let's agree," she says, "that whether he's real or not, our minstrel has done what all good ghosts do, made us listen." She raises her teacup. To Thomas of York, then, who proves that a tune never truly dies. The group echoes her toast, to Thomas. You sip, tasting warmth and iron. Somewhere deep inside, you swear you hear a faint string hum, the ghost of a chord barely formed. It might be imagination. It might be inheritance. In the end, that's what these gatherings are. Edwardian seances disguised as storytelling, bridging centuries through curiosity. Their world is too rational to pray, but too restless to stop listening. You lean back in your chair, firelight dancing over brass and glass. A few in the room glance toward the dark piano in the corner. For a second, you think one of its keys depresses ever so slightly, though no one has touched it. Maybe it's just the settling of the house. Maybe it's the minstrel politely applauding. The fire burns lower now, embers breathing softly beneath the grate like sleeping coals. Lady Pennington adjusts her shawl, and with a conspiratorial glance around the parlor, she says, "We've heard the minstrel's lament. Now let's speak of a lady. A lady with a lake and a sword, but not quite the one you think." A murmur of delight runs through the listeners. Arthurian tales were all the rage in Edwardian circles, safe to romanticize, easy to intellectualize. "We adore our ancestors' legends," Lady Pennington continues, "especially when we can embroider them with our own sensibilities." Her tone is dry but affectionate. You sink deeper into your chair. The air smells faintly of lavender and coal dust, and the velvet curtains absorb the lamplight like the surface of deep water. The hostess begins her version of the Lady of the Lake. But this isn't the shimmering enchantress from Tennyson's verses. This is a woman retold through Edwardian lips, one shaped by the rise of suffragettes, of drawing-room debates on gender and power. She wasn't born from water, Lady Pennington says. She chose it. And so begins the story of Nimue, recast as a woman who escaped a loveless feudal marriage by disappearing into the mists of her own making. Historians still argue whether her myth sprang from pre-Christian goddess worship or medieval poetic invention. But to Edwardian listeners, she is something more symbolic, a rebellion disguised as enchantment. In Lady Pennington's telling, the lake isn't a magical realm at all but a refuge. The lady waits beneath its mirrored surface, unseen by men who look only for reflections of themselves. When Arthur comes seeking his destiny, she doesn't give him the sword willingly. She tests him. For what is power, Lady Pennington asks, if not a woman deciding who may wield it? Someone chuckles softly. That's not how Mallory wrote it. Mallory never had to balance a household budget or fight Parliament for the vote, she replies sweetly, and the laughter that follows is both amused and uneasy. You feel the air shift. The fire crackles with a sudden spit of sap, and the scent of damp wood creeps in, like a lake breathing against its shore. In this moment, the myth feels alive again, refreshed, reinterpreted. The young artist leans forward. So she isn't a temptress or a saint, he says. She's a survivor. Exactly, Lady Pennington nods. And perhaps that's why she fascinates us. She gave the sword to men, yes, but she could just as easily take it back. A fringe fact slips into the conversation. Someone mentions that in the 14th century, certain medieval texts already blurred Nimue's identity, naming her Vivienne, Ninian, or even the Keeper of Silence. Some scholars propose that her story was recycled from older Celtic water spirits, guardians of thresholds, between land and water, between the mortal and divine. Or between obedience and defiance, Lady Pennington adds. The Edwardians sip their tea and pretend they're above such mythic symbolism, but their eyes betray them. In a world where women are still told to smile and sit pretty, the Lady of the Lake feels oddly modern. She's an emblem of control, quiet, watchful, capable of withdrawal. You imagine her standing waist-deep in a moonlit pool, skirts heavy with water, hair drifting like reeds. Not trapped, but choosing solitude over subservience. She doesn't speak, because she doesn't need to. The sword gleams in her hands like agency itself. One of the men clears his throat. If I may, Lady Pennington, Arthur's court relied on women as symbols of virtue, not instruments of revolution. Precisely why we're retelling the story, she answers. The laughter that follows feels a little forced, the kind used to soften the sharpness of truth. Someone cites a newly published essay on the mythic feminine in literature. Its author argues that Arthurian legends reflect a patriarchal longing for order disguised as romance. Others counter that myths evolve to mirror whoever tells them. You can almost hear the gears of Edwardian intellect turning, each trying to balance respectability with rebellion. Meanwhile, outside, the fog thickens, pressing its cool face against the window. It makes you think of the lake again, the boundary between seen and unseen. Perhaps that's why these stories persist. The Edwardians, with all their modern machinery, still live surrounded by thresholds, between empire and uncertainty, faith and reason, male and female, myth and machinery. Lady Pennington's voice softens as she concludes. The Lady of the Lake never truly left us, she says. She's in every woman who learns when to vanish and when to emerge, shining. Silence, only the crackle of the fire answers. Then, from the far side of the room, the journalist speaks. You know, she says, there's a pond near Winchester said to be bottomless. Local children still call it Nimue's Well. Once a year on Midsummer's Eve, they throw in a silver coin to see if the water will return it by dawn. Some swear it does. Ah, says the professor, folklore persists where faith retreats. Or maybe, Lady Pennington replies with a smile, it's the same thing wearing different clothes. You glance again into your teacup. The firelight dances on its surface like rippling water. For a dizzy moment, you could swear you see the shimmer of a blade beneath it, thin, silver, patient. Then it's gone, and only your reflection remains. The room has grown warmer, the kind of heat that makes silk collars wilt and tea taste like smoke. A footman slips quietly through, refilling cups and pretending not to eavesdrop. Someone stirs the coals with a brass poker, and sparks leap up like startled fireflies. Lady Pennington, clearly satisfied with her tale, nods to the man beside her, a small, fidgety fellow with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose. "Mr. Blake," she says, "you promised us something humbler this evening. No dragons, no heroines, just one honest cobbler, yes." Blake clears his throat, his accent more Yorkshire than Mayfair. "Indeed, madam, though I can't promise the story stays humble for long." A ripple of amusement. You take another sip of tea, now cooled to the temperature of secrets. He begins. "There once was a cobbler who worked in the shadow of the king's palace. He mended boots for guards and stable hands, and sometimes, so rumor said, for the king himself. One winter night, long after curfew, he heard a knock at his door. A customer, cloaked and silent, handed him a pair of worn leather shoes. 'Repair them by dawn,' the stranger said, 'and name your price.' Then he vanished into the snow." Blake pauses for effect. By morning, the shoes were whole again, but they walked away before the cobbler could return them. A woman gasps theatrically. The professor mutters, "Ah, animated footwear, a common medieval motif, probably allegorical." But Blake shakes his head. This wasn't allegory. This was history, or at least, the kind York's archives keep politely hidden. In the late 14th century, King Richard II was rumored to disguise himself among commoners at night. A cobbler's ledger was found a century later with an entry that read, "Shoes for the night traveler, paid in silence." Historians still argue whether that meant a royal visit or something stranger. The parlor hums with intrigue. "Now," Blake continues, "the cobbler, terrified and fascinated, followed the tracks in the snow. They led him straight to the palace gates, where the guards saw nothing, heard nothing. But inside, the king was said to have dreamed of walking barefoot through his throne room, the sound of steps echoing behind him." "Splendidly eerie," says Lady Pennington. "And true?" asks the journalist. "As true as any story polished by time," Blake replies with a shrug. You picture it easily. The narrow medieval alley, snow-muffling sound, a lamplight guttering in the wind. A lonely craftsman, his hands cracked from labor, staring at footprints that seem to continue without a walker. It's the kind of image that would have delighted both monks and moderns, a moral lesson or a metaphor for ambition. Blake goes on, warming to his tale. The cobbler was summoned to court the next day. The king, whether it was Richard or some later monarch, asked him a single question. "If my shoes walked without me, who ruled the road?" The cobbler, being no fool, answered, "Whoever walked beside them, your majesty." Laughter fills the parlor, gentle and approving. "Clever man," Lady Pennington says. "The clever often survive longest," Blake replies. "Though some say the cobbler's descendants still find footprints in fresh snow outside their shops, 2 pairs, one visible, one not." He sits back, pleased with himself. A pause follows, the kind of thoughtful silence that belongs only to good stories and slightly oversteeped tea. Then the young artist asks, "What do you think it means? The shoes walking away?" The professor sniffs. A parable of power, clearly, a warning against ambition. Lady Pennington disagrees. "No, it's about craft. The cobbler's creation outgrew him, like all inventions. Isn't that the story of our age?" You can't help but smile at the irony. The Edwardians, surrounded by machines that hum and breathe like metal familiars, are still telling tales about shoes that move on their own. Progress, it seems, is just another form of enchantment. Blake adds a final flourish. Some fringe chroniclers even claim the shoes were relics of Saint Crispin, patron of cobblers, said to bring fortune, or misfortune, to those who mend them. But the church never confirmed it, and historians still argue whether the relic ever existed outside the guild's imagination. The journalist scribbles something in her notebook. "So the king's secret," she says slowly, "was that he walked among his people, or that he couldn't stop walking?" "Both," Blake replies softly. "Perhaps that's what power is, movement without peace." The fire snaps sharply at that line, as though agreeing. The conversation drifts from myth to memory. Someone recalls that during the Great Exhibition 50 years earlier, a pair of medieval shoes was displayed, stitched with gold thread so fine that magnifying glasses were provided. The plaque read, "Recovered from beneath Westminster Hall, date uncertain." No one could explain how the soles were worn thin when the shoes themselves had never been walked in. "Ah, but history loves its puzzles," says Lady Pennington. "We make myths out of evidence and evidence out of myths. It's the only way to stay sane." The group laughs again, though it's a quieter sound this time, thoughtful, almost reverent. You notice how the conversation always circles back to the same place, the border between belief and skepticism. The Edwardians stand exactly there, balancing their teacups on the edge of wonder. Outside, wind brushes the window. Somewhere in the darkness, a cartwheel squeaks, then fades. You think of those phantom shoes again, packing the courtyard of some forgotten palace, tracing the same path century after century, waiting for the next storyteller to follow. The laughter lingers like perfume, curling into the air as Mr. Blake sits back down. The fire has mellowed now, its crackle steady and hypnotic. The scent of coal, leather, and polish mixes with something faintly sweet, perhaps the remnants of port or plum pudding. Lady Pennington claps her hands softly, as though sealing the last story into the air. "Well," she says, "we've had ghosts, goddesses, and cobblers. Time for something divine, or at least divinely inconvenient." Her eyes flick toward the vicar sitting in the far corner, a round, rosy man whose collar seems to strangle him slightly. "Reverend Miles," she teases, "you promised to bring us a saint's tale, but only if it misbehaved." The vicar chuckles, cheeks wobbling. "I did, didn't I? All right, but mind, it's a tale about faith and folly. One can hardly tell the difference when relics are involved." You feel the parlor lean closer. Even the skeptical professor seems amused. The Edwardians, for all their sophistication, love nothing more than the awkward coexistence of science and sanctity. The Reverend begins. The story goes that in the year 1279, in the Abbey of Glastonbury, a monk named Brother Elias claimed to possess a holy relic, one of St. Dunstan's tongs. You know, the blacksmith saint who pinched the devil's nose with red-hot irons. A few chuckles ripple through the room. "Well," the Reverend continues, "Brother Elias insisted the tongs could heal the sick, especially those suffering from nosebleeds, naturally. Pilgrims came in droves, dropping coins into the abbey chest. But then came the trouble. The relic began misbehaving." Someone raises an eyebrow. "Misbehaving how?" "The tongs moved on their own," the Reverend says with theatrical solemnity. "Or so the monks claimed. They'd be found hanging in a new place each morning, sometimes outside the chapel, sometimes in the refectory, once even wedged in a loaf of bread." The room erupts in polite laughter. "Perhaps," says the journalist, "a case of somnambulant piety." "Perhaps," the Reverend admits. "Or perhaps jealousy. You see, the abbot suspected Brother Elias of faking miracles to attract donations. A royal inspector was sent. The relic was examined, pronounced ordinary iron, and confiscated. But that night the inspector's horse threw him into a river, and the tongs were found on the bank beside him, steaming as if just pulled from a forge." Lady Pennington leans forward, chin in hand. "And what became of Brother Elias?" "Ah," the Reverend smiles. "He disappeared shortly after. Some said he joined a hermitage near Wells. Others swore he was seen years later, shoeing horses for a traveling fair, always carrying a small iron tong on his belt." "Deliciously improbable," the professor declares. "No record of such an event in the Glastonbury rolls." "Ah, but there is a marginal note in a 14th century copy of the Life of St. Dunstan," the Reverend counters. "A scribe wrote, 'Beware the tool that moves without hand.' Historians still argue whether he meant a metaphor for sin or a literal complaint about misplaced utensils." The parlor roars with laughter. You grin, watching the glow of the lamps reflect off spectacles and silverware. The Edwardians delight in these stories because they let them laugh at superstition while secretly savoring it. They see their ancestors as charmingly gullible, never noticing how close they stand to them in spirit. The Reverend, however, isn't done. He lowers his voice. Now here's the curious part. When the Abbey ruins were excavated in 1908, just 2 years ago, a blackened pair of iron tongs was indeed recovered from near the old refectory wall. They're in the Somerset Museum now. The professor blinks. Surely a coincidence. Surely, says the Reverend. And yet, the curator claims the glass display case fogs from within every winter solstice. A hush falls across the room. Even the fire seems to pause its hiss. The vicar's smile is mild, but his eyes twinkle. It's only condensation, of course, perfectly natural, but it does make you wonder. Lady Pennington claps lightly, delighted. That's precisely what makes a good story, Reverend. Faith and physics shaking hands. You can't help but notice how the conversation that follows is less boisterous, more thoughtful. The Edwardians are proud rationalists, yet there's a gleam in their eyes, the thrill of being just superstitious enough to feel alive. Someone recalls a similar medieval legend. St. Cuthbert's incorrupt body found warm centuries after burial. Historians still argue, the professor sighs, whether it was miraculous preservation or the handiwork of clever monks with too much salt. The Reverend shrugs. And what's the difference? A miracle explained remains miraculous. That line hangs in the air. You realize how every story tonight teeters on that same balance. Faith dressed up in logic, logic flirting with faith. It's the Edwardian condition in miniature. Progress lit by candlelight. Lady Pennington, ever the hostess, rises to pour more tea. Well then, she says, smiling toward you, let's toast to Brother Elias and his holy tongs, which remind us that even saints can have a sense of humor. Everyone lifts their cups. You do too. The warmth of the porcelain seeps into your palms. Somewhere, perhaps only in imagination, you hear the faint clang of metal striking metal, as if a faraway forge has come to life again. The Reverend settles back, satisfied. That's all for my relics, he says. I'll leave dragons and devils to you brave souls. But as the laughter resumes, you can't shake the feeling that the fire just hissed in rhythm with an unseen hammer's swing. 1, 2, 3, like a saint at work, somewhere beyond reason. You've been sitting by the fire long enough now that the edges of the room blur. The wallpaper's gilt motifs seem to shimmer, like faint dragon scales catching the light. Outside, the Edwardian night is draped in mist, but in here, the company has grown mellow with port and the faint perfume of cigars. Sir Aubrey Locksley, the evening's unrepentant raconteur, stands by the hearth with one hand on the mantel and the other cradling a glass of amber gin. His voice is as rich as the furniture, lacquered, polished, and slightly self-satisfied. Now then, he says, with a conspiratorial grin, you can mock me all you like, but I saw it. The professor arches a skeptical brow. Saw what, Aubrey? Another will-o'-the-wisp, or perhaps that ghost hound you invented in Somerset? Locksley chuckles. Neither. This was Dorset, proper Wessex soil, not a ghost but a dragon. A ripple of laughter rolls through the parlor, polite but curious. You sip your drink, pretending not to care, though a small part of you perks up. The word dragon has a way of stirring something that no amount of modern science quite dampens. He leans closer to the fire, letting the shadows play across his face. It was the summer of '03. I'd taken the carriage south to visit an estate near Cerne Abbas. You know the place, with that rather indecent chalk giant carved into the hill. A few chuckles. The Reverend coughs into his hand. Well, I'd gone there to hunt pheasant, he continues, but the weather turned foul. By the third evening I was restless, and so I wandered the downs. That's when I saw it, at least, the smoke first. He gestures with his glass. Not from a chimney or a fire. No, this came from a barrow, a Neolithic burial mound, long overgrown. The ground itself was breathing, smoke rising in thin curls like steam off a sleeping beast. Someone scoffs, though not unkindly. Surely the earth vents you mention are natural, sulfur springs perhaps. Geology, yes, yes, Loxley replies, waving a dismissive hand. And yet when I stepped closer I felt warmth underfoot. And then God's truth, a low rumbling sound. Deep, steady, rhythmic. It wasn't wind, nor water, nor the gin, thank you very much. It was alive. You lean forward despite yourself. The crackle of the fire sounds suddenly too loud, too deliberate. Historians still argue, the professor begins, whether dragons were simply medieval misinterpretations of fossilized creatures. Peasants finding dinosaur bones, you see, mistaking them for monsters. Quite so, says the Reverend, and yet, he glances into the flames. Every myth begins somewhere. Perhaps your barrow holds such relics still, creatures God buried before man was wise enough to name them. Or drunk enough to imagine them, the journalist mutters, earning a smothered laugh. Sir Aubrey smirks. Mock if you must. I returned at dawn with a local shepherd. The smoke was gone, the ground cold, but where the soil had split, we found a pattern scorched into the turf, a perfect spiral, blackened as though by lightning. The shepherd crossed himself and said the barrow had exhaled. He pauses for effect, lowering his voice. They call that hill Dragon's Rest now. The locals won't pasture cattle there, not even today. Some say the thing still sleeps beneath. Others say it flew off during the great storm of 1703 and took half the cliffs with it. The group murmurs. Someone refills their glass. Lady Pennington, half hidden by the firelight, tilts her head. You know, she says softly, in the 14th century, a monk named Wulfric recorded smoke over that same region. He described it as the exhalation of a buried serpent whose breath poisons the air. Loxley beams. You see, vindication. Or plagiarism, the professor counters dryly. You can't help smiling. The debate spins merrily, half belief and half parlor sport. Yet as you watch the flames lick the grate, you picture that lonely mound on the downs, the grass whispering in the wind, and the faint taste of sulfur in the air. The talk drifts toward folklore. Someone mentions the Lambton worm, another the drake of St. Leonard's Forest. The Reverend recalls that even St. George's dragon may have been borrowed from pagan tales older than Christendom itself. Dragons, Lady Pennington muses, seem to slumber where we most fear to dig, beneath our histories, our guilt, our bones. You glance around the circle. The older men nod sagely, the younger ones pretend not to shiver. You imagine for a moment standing on that Dorset hill at dusk, the air thick with the smell of rain, the earth beneath your boots faintly trembling. Maybe it's only gas pockets shifting. Maybe it's something that remembers an older age, the time when maps still warned, here be dragons. A crack in the firewood sends up a spark. Everyone flinches, then laughs it off, but no one quite relaxes again. Another gin, Lady Pennington offers softly, to steady our courage should we find ourselves in Dorset one day. They agree, and the room hums with talk of old hunts and strange fossils. One guest mentions Mary Anning, the Lyme Regis fossil hunter who shocked Victorian society by finding monsters in stone. She gave dragons their bones, he says, and that frightened people more than any myth. Quite right, says the journalist. It's one thing to imagine monsters, another to find proof you're not their first descendant. You can't resist smiling. The Edwardians are so certain of progress, yet they tremble at every ancient shadow that flutters through the scientific light. The clock ticks louder now. The warmth in the room is thick and golden, and the hour is too late for certainty. Sir Aubrey finishes his gin, eyes glinting mischievously. Laugh all you like, he says, but one day when the downs quake again, I shall be waiting, net in hand, to claim my dragon's skull. Or its appetite, you murmur just loudly enough. The laughter that follows is easy, relieved. But long after the glasses are cleared and the lamps dim, a faint scent of smoke still lingers. Not cigar, not oak, something older, something that might, if you were less awake, smell like the breath of sleeping scales beneath the soil. You leave the room with that image. Dorset's dark hill rising under the stars, a thin wisp of smoke drifting skyward, as though the earth itself sighs in its sleep. And you think, if dragons are only metaphors, why do they keep breathing? The next evening, the fog returns, thicker this time, curling in through the cracks like a living thing trying to listen. The fire burns bright in Lady Pennington's parlor, pushing back the chill with golden insistence. The guests have rearranged themselves, the Reverend nearer the flames, the journalist slouched in his armchair with a notebook balanced on his knee, and the professor already thumbing through a leather-bound volume like a man preparing to duel with words. Lady Pennington lifts a stack of yellowed papers from the side table and fans them out like a deck of cards. "Tonight," she declares, "we have something quite special. Found only last month in the library at St. John's College, Cambridge, a fragment of what seems to be an unfinished tale from Chaucer's time. That gets everyone's attention, even you sit up straighter." She smiles faintly. It's been dubbed the Pilgrim's Last Tale. The Reverend leans forward, but Chaucer never finished his Canterbury Tales. "Precisely," she replies, "and some scholars argue he intended one final story, perhaps one too subversive, too melancholy to share. This, it seems, may be a copy." She unfolds the parchment with delicate care. The ink has faded to brown ghosts, but her voice carries it back to life. "And so the pilgrim, grown weary of pious speech, sat by the road where sinners teach. For all our miles, for all our creed, what solace found we in the deed?" The room falls silent. There's something unsettling about the rhythm, too modern, too knowing. Lady Pennington continues, "Our Cambridge Don believes it was written by one of Chaucer's students, a sort of late imitation. Yet, historians still argue whether it might be his own, penned near the end of his life when he'd seen enough of priests and kings to grow tired of both." You picture the aging poet by candlelight, ink pooling in the hollow of his quill, the world around him changing faster than faith could keep up. The laughter of the Canterbury pilgrims has thinned to whispers. The journalist breaks the quiet, and what's the rest of it say? Lady Pennington hesitates, glancing toward the Reverend. It becomes less wholesome. A grin spreads across the journalist's face. "Splendid, carry on." She takes a steadying sip of tea and reads again. "Then came the clerk, who feared not hell, but reckoned truth his book to sell. And merchants, whose souls were thin as thread, counting beads not prayers but debts instead." You can't help but laugh softly. It sounds like the Middle Ages had bankers too. "Indeed," says the professor, and Chaucer never missed a chance to jab at hypocrisy. But this tone, this weary humor, suggests something darker. He was mocking not to amuse but to survive disappointment. "Ah," Lady Pennington says, "then you'll love the ending." She clears her throat and reads the final lines, voice quieter now. "For Pilgrim's Road is ever long, and none may finish but in song. So sing we lies to tell our truth, as age makes poets out of youth." The Reverend folds his hands, thoughtful. A confession, perhaps, that faith and fiction are twin instruments, each striking what the other cannot. The professor nods reluctantly, or that he saw his work as incomplete, like mankind's own moral journey. But, the journalist adds, if it was written later, then it's Edwardian of us, isn't it, to rediscover an old disillusionment and call it art again? You smile at that. The conversation spirals from there, Chaucer to satire, satire to the soul of storytelling. Someone mentions that the Victorians once censored the bawdier Canterbury Tales, printing them privately for educated gentlemen only. Someone else recalls that the Edwardians, in their polite decline, began to crave such indecent vitality again. The room warms with laughter. You realize that this is what binds them all, then and now. Every age rediscovers its own hypocrisy and dresses it up as wisdom. Lady Pennington folds the parchment and sets it aside. The irony, she says softly, is that the tale survived only because someone deemed it unfit to print, hidden in a drawer, safe from the moralizers. Rather like half of tonight's conversation, you say, earning a grin from the journalist and a scandalized tut from the reverend. A log collapses in the grate, sending a puff of sparks into the air. For a moment, it looks like a scatter of letters rising and fading, the last words of the pilgrim's ghost. Lady Pennington gazes into the fire. Perhaps that's the true end of the Canterbury Road, she murmurs. Not salvation, not damnation, just a quiet room, a warm fire, and friends arguing about what the story meant. Outside, the fog presses against the window panes like unspoken verses, trying to get in. Inside, the laughter softens, the night winding itself into contented exhaustion. You think about that lost pilgrim, trudging forever between devotion and doubt. And in the faint crackle of the hearth, you almost hear the rhythm of his footsteps, steady, human, unfinished. The night deepens and the last of the port is gone. The decanter stands empty, its glass catching the firelight like a small, dying sun. Lady Pennington rises from her chair, slowly, ceremoniously, and gestures toward the heavy curtains. "Keep them drawn," she says. "This next story doesn't like windows." That, of course, gets everyone's attention. She moves to the fireplace, the hem of her gown whispering against the carpet, and rests one hand on the mantelpiece. Her face, half-lit by flame, looks carved from amber. "It's not mine," she says, "but something I was told years ago by my governess, an abbey story, the sort that clings." You shift a little closer, careful not to break the silence. "It was Fountains Abbey," she begins. "A ruin even then, long before tourists began picnicking in the nave and calling it romantic. My governess said she'd been there as a girl before they fenced it. She swore the bells still rang." "Impossible," says the professor reflexively. "They were dismantled in the 16th century, melted for Henry's coffers." Lady Pennington smiles faintly. "Of course, that's what everyone says, but she heard them, low, faint, tolling from nowhere, only in mist." The Reverend leans forward, hands clasped. "Ah, the legend of the Abbey bells. I've heard variations. Some say they ring to warn of death, others that they sound when a soul is freed from purgatory." Lady Pennington nods, "And some say they mark a debt unpaid." The journalist, half drunk and half curious, laughs softly. "A debt? To whom?" "To the land," she says. "You see, when the abbey fell, the monks were expelled, the altars stripped, the relics carted off. But one bell was hidden, a gift from a local foundryman who refused to see it taken. He buried it beneath the floor of the chapter house, sealed in stone. He said it was blessed and that its silence would guard the ruins from desecration." You can feel the room leaning in now. But she continues, "A century later, a farmer broke the ground there digging for lead. That night a storm rose out of nowhere. The river flooded the valley, drowning his cattle and washing half his fields away. The villagers said it was the bell's revenge. So they filled the pit again, left the place alone." A log shifts in the grate with a hollow crack. The sound feels too deliberate, too close. "Since then," Lady Pennington whispers, "whenever mist rolls up from the valley, people claim they hear the bells toll, muffled, underwater, as if the abbey itself remembers being sanctified. And anyone foolish enough to answer that sound with speech." She pauses. "They say it takes your voice." The journalist chuckles nervously. "Convenient myth for silencing tourists." The professor smirks. "Or the echoes of the river's current. Sound behaves strangely among ruins." "Historians still argue," the Reverend interjects gently, "whether such tales were born from faith or fear. Bells are sacred, yes, but they also bind the living and the dead. Once blessed, they cannot simply stop ringing. Not truly." You think of the dragon of Dorset, the buried iron humming beneath the soil. It feels like tonight's stories have begun to rhyme. Lady Pennington sits again, her eyes still on the fire. My governess said she went back once, years later. The ruins were fenced, the grass tall, but the air felt hollow. And when dusk came, she swore she heard the faintest chime, not loud, not clear, just one note ringing as if struck from beneath her feet. She ran, of course, never returned. The professor, ever rational, chuckles. A fine ghost story, though lacking empirical evidence. Empirical evidence, Lady Pennington echoes softly, is always optional at midnight. That draws laughter, warm, relieved, perhaps even grateful. But beneath the mirth, there's a shared unease, like static under music. The reverend hums the faint pattern of a hymn. The fire sputters, its light trembling across gilt frames and glassware. You catch your own reflection in the window, dim, doubled, faintly distorted. The fog outside is so thick it looks like it's pressing against the glass. For just an instant, you imagine a pale figure standing in it, listening from the other side. Someone, maybe, you asks, do you think they really ring? Lady Pennington doesn't look up. I think memory is a bell, she says. Once struck, it never stops entirely. The air just grows tired of carrying the sound. A hush follows. The professor clears his throat as if to say something clever, but the moment passes. The clock ticks, steady and small. The air smells of ash and candle wax. Outside, the fog thickens until even the faint lamplight fades away. Somewhere beyond the walls, in that wet, invisible dark, you almost hear it. One low chime, then silence. You tell yourself it's imagination, but your breath catches just the same. By the next night, the fire has burned lower, the air dense with the slow perfume of wood smoke and candle tallow. The conversation meanders toward the melancholy, the kind of talk that happens when the hour has grown too late for wit and too early for sleep. Lady Pennington pours the last of the claret, and someone sighs. We've spoken of dragons and bells, but what of knights? Surely we deserve one gallant tale before the embers die. The professor chuckles. A gallant knight, in this age of automobiles. The poor fellow would hardly find a horse brave enough to face London traffic. But Lady Pennington's smile is sly. There's one more story, she says, and it fits tonight's mood perfectly. The legend of the knight who slept 100 years. You feel the room draw closer again. Even the journalist, who has long since given up on skepticism, leans forward with a grin. She begins, her voice gentle and measured. It's said that in the time of Edward IV, a knight named Sir Edric of Wessex rode into a deep wood to meet his beloved, a lady promised to another. Their affair was doomed, of course, as such things usually are. One night he rode to her father's estate to steal her away, but she never came. Instead, he was met by a storm, lightning, rain, thunder that tore branches from trees, and when the sky cleared, Sir Edric was gone. She pauses to sip her wine, eyes glittering in the half-light. Gone for a century. The Reverend murmurs, "Ah, one of those enchanted sleeps. A Christian retelling of the old pagan motif, perhaps." "Perhaps," Lady Pennington replies. But here's the curious part. The tale says he was found, alive, armored, and whole, by a group of shepherds near Shaftesbury exactly 100 years later to the day. His hair had not grayed, his skin unwrinkled. When they roused him, he blinked at the sun and asked, "Has she forgiven me yet?" The fire cracks sharply, and someone exhales. He returned to his family's estate, she continues, only to find strangers in his hall, his name forgotten. The land had changed. The language sounded strange to his ear. He was taken for a madman and placed in the care of monks. There he grew quiet, sketching scenes of battle and love on the margins of their manuscripts, each one signed not Edric, but the Sleeper of Wessex. Historians still argue, says the professor, whether the story sprang from local folklore or if it disguised something more political. Perhaps the sleep was exile, the awakening a return during better fortunes. Allegory, not enchantment. The journalist grins. And yet, a sleeping knight fits us rather neatly, doesn't it? a chivalric fossil in the modern age, the Edwardians dreaming in steel while the world readies for war. The Reverend winces at the cynicism, but doesn't disagree. Lady Pennington sets down her glass. "It's said," she continues softly, "that before his death the knight confessed to a monk that he'd never truly slept at all. He'd simply stepped outside of time. He claimed the forest had shown him what was coming: iron horses, great birds that breathed fire, and cities of smoke that swallowed the sun. He said he wished he'd never woken." The professor leans back. "A myth born of anxiety. Every generation imagines the next will outgrow its soul." "Or that it already has," Lady Pennington murmurs. You think of the train whistles beyond the city, the faint electrical hum that rides the evening air. To an age that once believed time was sacred, these new engines must have seemed like heresy. Maybe Sir Edric hadn't been cursed. Maybe he'd simply glimpsed the future and couldn't bear its pace. The Reverend breaks the silence. "There's a parallel in Scripture: those who sleep until the world is remade. Resurrection as metaphor for renewal." "Or for exhaustion," you say quietly. "He slept because he couldn't keep up." That earns a murmur of agreement. The Edwardian parlor suddenly feels older than its years, heavy with the sense that its comforts, lace, brass, polished walnut, belong to an age nodding off at history's edge. Lady Pennington gazes into the fire, her expression soft. The story ends with the knight buried under a yew tree, his armor sealed in stone. They say the monks inscribed one phrase upon his tomb: "He will wake when the world remembers how to rest." You let that linger. The flames hiss softly like a sigh through metal. Outside, the fog curls and uncurls against the glass, a slow breath. Somewhere a clock chimes 12, each note measured, patient, as if marking time for something long asleep beneath the soil. You look at the fire again, its heart pulsing gold and red, and for just a heartbeat you imagine the reflection of a visor there, bright, waiting, watching. You blink and it's gone. "Another?" asks the professor, half yawning. "Or shall we end on that fine melancholy?" Lady Pennington smiles. "Let the night sleep, at least until dawn." And so the conversation fades, drifting into small talk and slow laughter. Yet the silence between words feels different now, thicker, like the hush of a chapel that remembers prayer. You sit back, drowsy but alert, aware that in this fire-lit room the past is not behind you. It's simply dozing, like the Knight of Wessex, waiting to wake when the world grows quiet enough to listen. The next night begins not with laughter, but with the soft, steady rhythm of rain tapping at the windows. It's the kind of sound that settles everyone into a reflective hush before a word is even spoken. The fire burns low, but its light still gilds the corners of the parlor, bookshelves gleaming like wet bark, decanters glowing ruby and amber, the slow curl of cigar smoke tracing sleepy halos in the air. The professor leans forward, chin propped on his cane. "We've had dragons, saints, sleeping knights. What about curses? Every century seems to invent its own." The journalist smirks. "Ah, yes, the Edwardian love affair with the doomed and the decorative. No legend stirred them quite like that of the luck of Lewisham Hall." You raise an eyebrow. "Luck?" He chuckles, "or the lack of it." He begins the story in the rhythm of someone used to dictating for print, smooth, measured, slightly theatrical. The Lewisham family had been minor gentry since the days of the Plantagenets. Their crest, a stag beneath a crescent moon, was said to have been granted to an ancestor who saved the king's hunting party from a ghostly white deer. But according to rumor, the deer cursed them as it fell, promising that no generation would pass without one heir, lost to madness or fire. Lady Pennington shivers theatrically. "How very Gothic." "It gets better," says the journalist, leaning closer. "In 1905, a certain Sir Harold Lewisham invited half of Sussex's society to see his newly restored hall. He'd filled it with medieval relics, swords, tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, even a replica of his ancestor's crest carved into the mantel. and in the center of the dining room hung what he called the luck, a small silver charm shaped like a stag's head, suspended by a ribbon. The Reverend frowns. I sense the story does not end well. The journalist grins. You sense correctly. He lowers his voice. During the grand unveiling, Sir Harold boasted that the old curse was nothing but superstition. He toasted to banishing the ghosts of history. Moments later, the chandelier's chain snapped. Glass rained down, candles flew, and the tablecloth caught fire. 2 guests were injured, and the stag's charm melted into a lump of silver. The fire in the parlor crackles, punctuating the tale. Historians still argue, he adds, whether the accident was mechanical failure or deliberate sabotage. Some claim a rival collector loosened the chain. Others say Sir Harold's own brother had reason to see him disgraced. Lady Pennington tilts her head, and Sir Harold, unharmed, but within a month he was committed to a private asylum, convinced the stag's head followed him in every reflection. You shift slightly in your chair, and the charm. The journalist smiles. It vanished, but 2 decades later, a curator cataloging an Edwardian collection in Bath discovered a melted silver mass shaped like, well, some say it looked like a deer's skull. Others insist it resembled a screaming face. It's now in the basement of the British Museum, unlabeled. The professor chuckles. A classic Edwardian moral, hubris meets history. They were always trying to civilize the supernatural. Or aestheticize it, Lady Pennington muses. They adored fear as long as it matched the furniture. You laugh softly. A haunted mansion but tasteful. Precisely, says the journalist, lighting another cigarette. The Edwardian imagination loved its ghosts perfumed, its horrors upholstered. But the strange thing is, every record of that fire mentioned something odd. When they rebuilt the chandelier, the ceiling above showed no sign of heat damage. No scorch, no blackening, as if the flames had burned only in the reflection of the glass. That thought hangs in the room like smoke. The Reverend murmurs a verse, something about mirrors and truth, and you feel a chill run through you. Maybe that's what the Edwardians feared most, that they were reflections themselves, ornate and fragile, sustained by light but consumed by their own vanity. You glance toward the window. The rain has slowed, the glass glistening with tiny mirrored beads. For a moment the fire's reflection trembles in them like a constellation. And in that shimmer you almost see a stag, antlers of gold, eyes hollow and watching. You blink, just rain again. Superstition, the professor says lightly. But still there's something poetic in it, a curse born of pride and beauty, very Edwardian indeed. Lady Pennington raises her glass. To beauty, then, and to surviving our reflections. You clink glasses, the crystal ringing faintly, as if answering from another century. Somewhere deep within the house, a floorboard creaks. Perhaps it's just the timber settling. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the old legends of madness and fire never quite let go. The journalist exhales a curl of smoke. Funny, isn't it? They tried so hard to make myths respectable, but the myths never stopped making fools of them. You smile faintly, listening to the patter of rain easing into silence. And for a heartbeat, you imagine the silver stag glimmering in the dark, burnished, defiant, immortal in its own way. By now, the parlor has grown almost ritualistic. Each night a new legend, a new mood, the same crackle of logs that seem to summon stories from the air itself. The guests no longer sit with polite distance. The chairs have drawn closer to the hearth, knees nearly touching, eyes gleaming with the soft hypnosis of routine enchantment. Tonight, Lady Pennington's maid brings in a tray of tea instead of wine, claiming the hour suits soberer comforts. The firelight dances through the porcelain cups, turning them into little lanterns. And before you can ask what tale will rule the evening, the professor clears his throat. I have one, he says, voice gravelly but eager. A legend that came to England from the north, the tale of the wandering scholar. You can tell by the Reverend's smirk that he's heard it before, or thinks he has. But the professor's eyes glint with that particular joy of someone about to tell a story they've been saving for years. It begins, he says, with a storm in 1321. A scholar from York, fleeing plague and persecution, takes shelter in an abbey on the edge of the moors. He claims to be studying celestial harmonies, the music of the spheres, but he's also said to carry with him a book no one can read, bound in black leather and written in a script that shifts when looked upon. You lean forward and he smiles, taking his time. The monks welcomed him, as scholars do, but strange things began to happen. The bells rang without touch, the candle flames leaned toward him as though drawn by breath, and at night the brothers dreamed of voices counting backwards in Latin. Lady Pennington laughs softly, delightfully blasphemous. Indeed, says the professor, but the twist comes later. After the scholar left, the abbey fell silent, no birds, no insects, not even whined through the grass. And in the scriptorium, the head abbot found that every book, every scroll, every scrap of parchment had been rewritten. All bore the same words. He walks still, learning what God forgot. The Reverend shifts uneasily. A warning against pride, perhaps. Perhaps, the professor concedes. Historians still argue whether the tale was invented by the Benedictines to mock the early natural philosophers. Yet centuries later, in the Edwardian age, a certain antiquarian claimed to find a page matching that same black script, hidden inside a psalter from the very region. It now rests in the Bodleian Library, catalogued as illegible, possibly fraudulent. The journalist exhales, amused. So, an early example of academic forgery, rather on brand. But you notice that no one laughs too loudly. There's something unnerving in the idea of a book that rewrites other books, of knowledge that refuses to stay still. Lady Pennington speaks softly. You know, the Edwardians loved that legend. They said it explained the strange coincidences of their own age, the way discoveries seemed to come all at once, as though someone or something was walking among them again, whispering new equations, new machines, new catastrophes. The professor nods. They called it progress, others called it temptation. A log collapses in the grate with a low sigh, and sparks flutter upward like golden insects. You imagine that wandering scholar trudging through rain and smoke, his book breathing quietly at his side. You picture him stepping into Edwardian London, standing before a phonograph, an electric bulb, a motor car, and smiling, as if recognizing old ideas grown bold enough to burn. The Reverend murmurs, "If knowledge itself can be cursed, what hope have we?" The professor grins. Only the hope that curiosity outweighs caution, and it always does. There's a chuckle, half-hearted, yet the silence that follows feels heavy with something else, fascination's shadow twin, dread. You glance at the shelves around you. Hundreds of volumes, their spines catching the glow of the fire. What if one of them, quiet, unassuming, was still rewriting itself even now? You look back to the professor, and what became of the scholar? He shrugs. The usual endings. He was last seen walking into a storm, or he turned to dust when the monks opened his door. Or, my favorite, he simply kept walking, and every 100 years someone meets his gaze and forgets their own name. Lady Pennington exhales a shaky laugh. A fine bedtime story indeed. But when she reaches to pour another cup of tea, her hand trembles just slightly. The journalist, always the skeptic, breaks the tension with a grin. You know, there's a rumor at Cambridge that one of their oldest astronomy charts contains a set of stars not visible from Earth. It's unsigned, but the handwriting, they say it moves. The Reverend waves him off, though his tone isn't entirely convinced. More likely a trick of varnish and time. The professor nods. Perhaps, but we live in an age of rediscovery, my friends. The Edwardians were right about one thing. Every progress feels, at first, like forbidden knowledge. The rain outside deepens to a steady drum, the world beyond the windows utterly erased. You sit back, drowsy but alert, and wonder whether the scholar is still walking somewhere. Boots slick with rain, a shifting book under his arm, smiling at the glow of every new idea. The Reverend finally closes the Bible on his lap as if to end the night's sermon. "Let's hope," he says gently, "he never finds this house." You smile, unsure whether it's a joke or a prayer. The rain has stopped. The parlor air feels washed clean, though the scent of wet brick and chimney soot clings faintly at the edges. Outside, puddles shimmer like spilled ink beneath the gas lamps. Inside, the warmth has grown intimate, familiar enough that silence now feels like part of the conversation. It's the journalist this time who breaks it, tapping his fingers against his knee, as if trying to match the rhythm of some half-remembered story. "I've one for you," he says with a crooked grin. "But fair warning, it's less legend than local scandal, polished by gossip and time. The sort of tale the Edwardians adored precisely because they could pretend it was history." Lady Pennington leans back, amused. "Ah, the best kind." "It's called The Glassmaker's Secret," he begins. "And it starts in 1898 in a village near Canterbury. A craftsman named Thomas Ede ran a small glassworks, nothing grand, but his pieces were extraordinary. Delicate, iridescent like captured breath. Patrons said he used some medieval formula, something lost since the monks of Glastonbury. But Ede always said his real gift was simple. He listened to the glass while it cooled." You smile faintly. "Listened." "He claimed," says the journalist, "that glass remembers, that every piece holds echoes of what it once reflected, the faces, the rooms, even the weather. He said if you listened closely enough, you could hear voices in the cooling panes." The professor chuckles. "Nonsense, of course. Glass doesn't record sound." "True," the journalist replies, "but then came the accident." He lowers his tone. "In 1901, a fire broke out in the workshop. Ede escaped, but his apprentices didn't. The next morning, when the villagers came to sift through the ruins, they found the furnace intact. Inside were sheets of molten glass that had cooled overnight into mirror-smooth slabs, and on their surfaces—" He pauses for effect. "Faces, dozens of them, perfectly formed like portraits pressed in silver." Lady Pennington gasps softly. "Good heavens." "Historians still argue," he says, "whether it was coincidence, chemical reaction, or hysteria. The heat, the smoke, the shock all can play tricks on perception. But there were sketches made, charcoal drawings that survive, and one of those faces, by all accounts, was Ede's own." The Reverend crosses himself unconsciously. Vanity punished, perhaps, the old alchemist's sin. "Perhaps," the journalist concedes. "But the story didn't end there. Ede rebuilt his workshop and continued working, though he no longer sold his glass. Instead, he made a dozen windows for his own cottage, each with a faint shimmer, as if light hesitated passing through them. You picture it. The little house standing alone by the marsh, glass walls gleaming with strange, half-seen reflections. It's said," continues the journalist, "that when he died, the cottage was sealed by his daughter. Decades later, when developers arrived to clear the land, they found it exactly as he'd left it. Dust, cobwebs, and those windows still standing. One of the men tried to break a pane, and it didn't shatter, it sang. A pure, clear note like a bell underwater. Then every other window sang back." The professor mutters, "Vibrations, surely. Resonance." Lady Pennington, eyes wide, whispers, "Or a choir of ghosts." You chuckle softly. "Either way, it's beautiful." "Indeed," says the journalist. "The villagers called it the glassmaker's mass, they said on certain nights. When fog rolled in, you could hear those windows hum. A thin, trembling chord that carried all the way to the cathedral. And every time it sounded, a mirror somewhere in town would crack." The Reverend shakes his head, half smiling. "A moral, then. Creation without humility invites ruin." The professor disagrees. "No, a metaphor. The Edwardians feared what they could not see but could still feel. Electricity, radiation, sound waves, all invisible, all powerful. The tale isn't about ghosts, It's about the terror of transparency. Perhaps both, says Lady Pennington softly. Perhaps the fear was that beauty listens back. The fire pops, a small burst of sparks rising and vanishing. You glance toward the window. For an instant you think you see a faint shimmer there, a ripple that moves opposite the fire's reflection. You blink and it's gone. The journalist drains his tea and sets the cup down carefully. The funny thing is, he adds, one of Eads' paintings ended up in a museum exhibit around 1910. Visitors said that when the hall was empty, it sometimes whispered. A faint sighing sound like wind over a bottle. The curators blamed the heating ducts. Then one morning the glass was found fractured, 12 thin lines radiating from the center like a spiderweb. No impact, no stress marks, just an echo made visible. Lady Pennington hugs her shawl closer, a haunting in plain sight. You nod slowly, a story that's less about ghosts, more about memory. The Reverend smiles wearily, and yet memory is our gentlest ghost. Outside, the puddles glimmer under the moonlight, mirroring the flicker of the parlor. You can almost hear something faint, the hush of rain returning, or maybe, impossibly, the delicate chime of glass vibrating somewhere far away. You breathe in the warmth of the room, the comfort of company, and the delicate edge of unease that makes every story worth remembering. Tonight the fog has returned, so thick you can almost feel it pressing against the windows, muffling the world outside into a shapeless hush. Inside, the fire burns low and blue, the logs collapsing into a quiet bed of coals. The air smells of wool and smoke, and conversation moves slower now, like honey on a cold spoon. It's Lady Pennington who begins this time, her voice softer than usual, more thoughtful than theatrical. I wonder, she says, whether every legend hides a little truth, not in its facts but in its fear. The Edwardians loved fear. They made it elegant, but sometimes, I think, it was their way of confessing something they couldn't name. The Reverend smiles faintly. And what do you think they were confessing, my lady? She stares into the fire, and for a long moment the only sound is the slow sigh of the coals. Loneliness, she finally says. They were terrified of being forgotten. You feel the stillness ripple through the room, a small silence that invites story. And she obliges, as if she's been waiting for someone to ask. There was, she begins, a legend often told in the countryside before the Great War, the tale of the bellmaid of Ely. She was said to be a servant in the cathedral during the 15th century, one of the women who cleaned the great bells and polished the metalwork. One winter's night she vanished. Some said she ran away with a mason. Others whispered she was sealed inside one of the bells by accident. When the bell rang at Easter, her voice was heard singing from within. The professor murmurs, classic hagiography, the martyr turned melody. Perhaps, Lady Pennington says, but here, where it becomes odd. In 1903, during renovations at Ely, workers claimed that one of the bells began to hum by itself. Not ringing, humming, like breath caught in brass. They dismantled it, of course, and found nothing unusual. But one of the men reported hearing a woman's voice, very faint, repeating the same phrase, "Remember me when you rebuild." The journalist chuckles nervously. Coincidence, acoustics, metal fatigue. Maybe, she says. Yet 3 months later, the scaffolding collapsed during a thunderstorm and 2 men were killed. One of them, the same who'd heard the voice. The Reverend shifts, so the legend resurrected itself. Precisely, Lady Pennington says. The newspapers called it superstition, but the story spread. Soon people began visiting the cathedral to listen for her. They said if you stood beneath the bell tower at dusk, you could hear her humming softly like a lullaby made of metal. She sips her tea. And that's when the Edwardians made her their own. Painters, poets, even a stage production. She became a symbol of remembrance, the voice that refuses to fade. And do you know what they started calling her? The professor raises an eyebrow. What? The patron saint of forgotten things. There's a soft murmur of approval. The Reverend nods. Fitting. Every age invents its saints to comfort what it's lost. Historians still argue, she adds, whether the original tale ever existed before the 19th century. Some think it was entirely Edwardian, a myth dressed in medieval garb to make grief seem ancient and therefore easier to bear. You think about that, grief disguised as heritage. The Edwardians, after all, were perched on the brink of a century that would devour them. Maybe their love for the past wasn't nostalgia, it was survival. The professor smiles gently, a lovely thought that, memory as protection. Or as a haunting, says the journalist, staring into his glass. We cling to stories because they promise to remember us back. You can feel the heaviness settle. Not sorrow, exactly, but that tender ache of realization that every story told around a fire is really a small resistance against silence. Lady Pennington's eyes glimmer in the low light. They say the bellmaid's song changes depending on who hears it. To the guilty, it sounds like weeping. To the weary, a hymn. To the hopeful, a promise. And to you, asks the Reverend softly. She smiles, a fragile, wistful smile. To me, it sounds like time forgiving itself. For a long while, no one speaks. The fire sighs, the coals glow and dim, and the fog presses harder against the glass, as though it too is listening. You lean back, your eyes half closed, and think how strange it is that across centuries, one vanished woman, real or not, could still fill a room with her voice. And somewhere in that thought lies the heart of every Edwardian legend. That memory itself hums when touched by warmth. Outside, a clock tolls the hour. You could almost swear the bell's tone carries a second note, so faint it feels imagined, so clear it feels alive. Later, when the hour grows late enough for even skepticism to yawn, the Reverend pours what remains of the brandy into a single decanter and says, "Well then, if memory hums, as our lady poet here claims, perhaps conscience whispers, allow me one last story before the lamps are turned down." You notice he's smiling, but his eyes are set deeper than before, shadowed not by drink but by recollection. "This one," he begins, "comes from the House of Commons itself, or rather from what remains beneath it. Have any of you heard of the Night Parliament?" No one has. The journalist shakes his head. The professor leans forward. "It's a very old story," says the Reverend. "Supposedly born of the Great Reform Bill debates in the 1830s, but the Edwardians revived it during their own season of disillusion. You know how they loved a secret order, mystical societies, gentlemen's clubs devoted to alchemy and allegory. This one was darker." He sets the decanter down with a dull chime. "Legend says there are tunnels beneath Westminster that were never mapped, old crypts left over from the monastery that stood there before the Parliament was built. And in those catacombs, when the nation teeters on a moral precipice, the Night Parliament convenes. 12 figures, faceless, draped in black robes, bearing lanterns shaped like hourglasses. They gather to debate not laws but the nation's sins." A small laugh ripples through the room, but it dies quickly. The Reverend continues. "Each voice speaks for a forgotten class, the beggar, the widow, the pressman, the pauper child. And the 12th voice speaks for the dead, reminding the living what their promises cost. When dawn breaks, their words are erased, but their verdict remains. Some said that's why governments rise and fall without reason, because decisions are being made by those who have already paid the price." The journalist exhales. A fine metaphor. The Edwardians adored invisible power, ghostly accountability. "Indeed," says the Reverend. "But there were those who swore the Night Parliament was real. A civil servant in 1908 claimed to have followed a black-robed figure down a maintenance corridor beneath the clock tower. He described the sound of chanting, though he couldn't make out the words, only the refrain. 'The living forget, the dead remember.'" "Charming," murmurs Lady Pennington. "It gets stranger," he says. "The man was found 2 days later wandering the Thames embankment at dawn, coat soaked through, eyes blank. He could no longer speak. When questioned, he only wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper. Debate concluded unanimously." He died that night of apoplexy. The professor rubs his chin. Urban hysteria, surely. Perhaps, says the Reverend. But 2 weeks later, the government quietly withdrew a controversial housing bill, and in the archives, a marginal note appears on one of the drafts in unfamiliar ink. To build upon bones invites collapse. The fire pops, startling no one. By the time of the Edwardians, he continues, the story had taken on its full moral shape. They said whenever corruption spread too deep or pride rose too high, the night Parliament summoned its session. The sound of unseen debate echoed through the corridors, and those who heard it were changed, some struck mad, others redeemed. He looks around the room, gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. It was their conscience myth. Every age invents one, but the Edwardians needed it badly. They sensed the empire was beginning to rot from the inside, and they longed for an unseen hand to weigh their souls when they themselves lacked courage. Lady Pennington nods. We do love to believe someone else is still keeping the moral books. Quite so, he says, and perhaps that's what made their ghosts different. They weren't merely remnants of the past, they were auditors of the present. He leans back, voice softening. So they say, if you stand on Westminster Bridge at 3 in the morning when fog hides the spires and the river hushes its own tide, you may hear murmuring beneath your feet. Not traffic, not water, murmuring. The sound of voices endlessly arguing in the dark so that the living might someday learn to listen. The journalist raises his glass in mock salute. To the night Parliament, then, may they debate us kindly. But the Reverend doesn't smile. Careful what you toast, he says. They may already have taken the vote. Outside, Big Ben strikes one. The reverberation passes through the walls like a pulse.